Thank you. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined us today on this meeting. I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I'm on Dakota and Lakota and Ojibwe land. And this is really a particular honor for me. It's a special honor to have one's work engaged with by people that you just really respect and admire so much and have learned from so much over such a period of time. It's a particular honor for me in this case. As many of you know, I'm from Alberta. The University of Alberta gave me my first job, and I still have so many close friends and family there, and I really do consider it home. And so this is a particular honor for me to have this opportunity to re-engage with those people who have given so much to me. Thanks in particular to David and Catherine for organizing the event, to Cressida, Isabel, and Jakeet for agreeing to engage the work, and also to all of you for being here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this important topic.
So over to you, Isabel, if you want to.
Sure. Thank you, Robert, for the opportunity to comment on your book. I really enjoyed it very much. As I was saying earlier, it is going to be useful for the work that I'm doing right now. And I must say that somehow kind of difficult to have something smart to say, because it's really well researched and well argued. And so, but in that spirit, I want to engage and say a few things about the work. I really appreciated that the book is not only theoretically, theoretically rich, but it's also historically grounded. It's not just about looking at the meaning of dispossession and engaging in the ways different people have understood this concept, but it also traces the ways in which it has been used in different contexts historically. And I think that this is hugely important in the sense that it has implications for how Indigenous struggles articulate their claims today. And there are a number of things that the book does really, really well, and I'm just choosing a few of them here. And I invite all of you to read the book instead. So I believe that the focus on dispossession, particularly in the Anglosphere, couldn't be more relevant at this moment in this particular context. While for some people, dispossession might be a phenomenon of the past, the current violent incursions of Indigenous territories shows a continuity with what is happening today. Just look at the news and see how the war against Mi'kmaq fishing, for example, or the Trans Mountain Pipeline continue to be about Indigenous dispossession, continue to be about getting into these territories and taking these lands. So theft is property shows the scale and magnitude of dispossession in the Anglo-settler societies. It walks through a specific settler modality of land acquisition and highlights how non-proprietary Indigenous relations to land have been transformed into property, constituting how people see themselves, or people's subjectivities, into colonized and colonizers, into those that feel that they are entitled to land and resources, and those who they see as not having the right to enjoy these resources. And obviously the narratives that continue to justify land encroachment, or certain models of economic development that attempt against the earth itself and against the environment. I particularly appreciated the careful distinction that the book makes between dispossession in medieval Europe and Indigenous dispossession, as it was experienced in Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. It critiques the equation of exploitation, expropriation, and confiscation with dispossession, and actually shows how control over Indigenous lands has meant the recoding of land into sort of an abstract legal entity such as property, as if these making property into something abstract and something legal is beyond questioning. And sort of, I think that the book invites us precisely to look into what is behind the concept and notions of property and so on. And I also think that the job does an excellent job illustrating the dilemmas that the idea of property has posed for Indigenous people's resistance to dispossession. It certainly shows the different ways Indigenous peoples have responded to these dilemmas, the tensions, the negotiations arising from these responses. And I appreciate the discussion for thinking about Indigenous dispossession beyond, sort of like in more complex ways that go beyond the idea of possession itself. And that make us think about the political, legal orders and social orders that make Indigenous territories possible, but also that make other ways of living on this earth possible. That thinking about property doesn't allow us to even imagine. So in this sense, it's not land per se that is taken, it's not just land that is taken away from Indigenous peoples, but the relationships to territory, and that make these other ways of living on this earth possible. So the discussion in the book turns to the term desecration as a way to convey that with this dispossession is the earth itself that is damaged, that we're sort of causing harm to. However, I wish, Robert, that you spent a little bit more time talking about this, and maybe you can do that in your later on in your comments. I think that is, for me, it was kind of important to look at this term in the sense that I believe that it can help us understand what a little bit better what you call Indigenous expressive insurgency, especially because in the conclusion, you get into this discussion about what it means to struggle for something that is not thought of in possessive ways. But I want to return to this a little bit later. For now, I want to point to another element that I really enjoyed in the book, and that is talking about Indigenous resistance. With the idea of talking about property, of transforming non-proprietary relations to land into property, there is also Indigenous resistance. And in the same way that the book historicizes the uses of the concept of dispossession, it also looks into the long trajectory of Indigenous resistance and the intellectual ways in which Indigenous peoples have articulated the resistance to the idea of landed property. The question of what does it mean to struggle to defend something that was not possessed in the settler terms, but that Indigenous people still reclaim, is, in my view, crucial to understanding Indigenous peoples today. And it made me think about why Indigenous peoples call themselves, for example, land defenders, rather than using any other terms, right? So the book is careful in the sense of not flattening Indigenous resistance for they are not homogeneous. Indigenous peoples have employed different strategies. They have embraced the contradiction of reclaiming something that was not owned, but that somehow engages with the language of property. But that they also have also conveyed the idea that land continues to be, has been divested and continues to be divested from Indigenous peoples to the colonizers and land encroachers. But they also have articulated an effective reciprocal attachment to the earth, where defending land is a responsibility rather than a way of accessing property and enjoying property in the ways settlers understand property. And finally, I wanted just to mention that your discussion of what you term the expressive insurgency of Indigenous struggles, and the way you are framing these struggles in the way that they are not conflicts over property, but rather about relationships between humanity and the non-human world, I couldn't agree more with that. And as an example of you speak of the ways in which these struggles are reconfiguring dispossession itself by giving legal personality to entities of the non-human world. You make the point that this is a way to reverse the terms of dispossession in the sense that relationships between society and the ecological world are broadened. And this is huge, especially if we think as you do, of the extensive areas over which Indigenous peoples have tenure rights, not just in Canada or in the settler world, but actually all over the world. I understand that this is a strategy that is possible within politically constrained contexts of struggle, but I would like to hear your reactions to the questions of what do you think are the limits of bringing entities of the non-human world into a human-centered regime of rights and responsibilities. And I will conclude here.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Jakeet, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you to David and Catherine for the invitation to speak today. I really appreciate it and really looking forward to it. I'm really happy to be able to engage with a book that I really love. And so happy to finally get a chance to talk to others about it. My name is Jakeet Singh. I'm an assistant professor of politics at York University. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, the territory on which many nations have lived and continue to live, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis peoples, and the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit. And of course, the territory subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and Treaty. And I also, want to acknowledge that I grew up in Waterloo on the Haldimand Tract, which of course I never learned about in school and didn't even know I lived on the Haldimand Tract. And so that of course is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And so I want to express my appreciation and solidarity with the land defenders of 1492 Landback Lane on the Haldimand Tract right now, who are literally resisting the Haldimand OPP and the Haldimand mayor and others there, of course. So just wanted to acknowledge that as well. So the line of analysis and critique that I want to pursue here is to think about what Robert's analysis of dispossession, and especially his analysis of recursivity, can illuminate for us more generally about power and critique in colonial contexts, and more specifically when power is operating across different and highly unequal forms of life and traditions and normative and political languages, as is the case in lots of different, perhaps most, if not all, colonial contexts. So Robert is far too careful and good of a scholar to overextend his analysis and to overgeneralize it, especially in print. And so probably I'm going to speak a little bit more generally than he's comfortable with and that is to his taste, but maybe I can just get him to indulge me a bit since we're just on Zoom and this isn't in print or anything like that. So I want to start by thinking about Robert's book in relation to a much older book that he discusses and quotes favorably in his introduction, especially in his discussion about his approach to critical theory, a landmark book that was published in 1990, and also a book that I love very much and shaped me from early years in undergrad, that I happen to be rereading recently as well. And that is Iris Marion Young's Justice and the Politics of Difference. So this is kind of an odd pairing in some ways. I mean, in some ways Rob talks about the book in his introduction, and they talk about a shared kind of approach to critical theory in lots of ways, but it's a very different book in all kinds of other ways. So in some ways it's an odd pairing, but let's see, it made some sense in that I was reading both of them anyways, and it seemed to me posing a conversation between them highlighted some important things about what Rob is up to in this book and some of the really important interventions that he's making, and to help see where the field of critical theory has moved in some sense over time, hopefully. One of Young's main tasks in her goals in her book was to theorize oppression, trying to theorize and redescribe and build a common vocabulary to build bridges and solidarities among lots of different new social movements. And so she did so by kind of trying to disaggregate the concept of oppression into its 5 faces, very famously. These were the 5 faces of oppression that she tried to disaggregate the concept of oppression into, were, of course, exploitation, the transfer of the results of labor from one group to another, marginalization, the expulsion of some groups from participation in social and political and economic life, and the rendering of some groups not even worthy of exploitation. Powerlessness, what she described as a kind of lack of autonomy and ability to have a say over your life. Violence, so being subject to, as a group, to pattern, disproportionate, and systemic forms of bodily harm and vulnerability. And lastly, cultural imperialism, being subject to the dominant and universalized norms and of the dominant culture and group, including the othered representations and demeaning images of yourself and your group. So these were her 5 faces of oppression. Now, the first and most obvious thing to notice here when thinking about Young's book is that despite her repeatedly mentioning the American Indian movement as being one of the movements she's really concerned to speak to, the question of dispossession and territorial questions of acquisition and theft isn't part of the theory of oppression at all. And unfortunately, this is indicative of a whole generations of critical theorists who were concerned to theorize justice and injustice, but didn't pay sufficient attention to the question of land. Instead, they theorized forms of injustice and normative ideals of justice, largely without attention or without due attention to the land on which these just or unjust societies were built or were to be built. Robert's book and a whole generation of other scholars of settler colonial studies, of course, led by the uninterrupted struggle and work of generations of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous peoples, have attempted to make sure that whenever we talk about justice, injustice, oppression, and liberation, that we always talk about land and dispossession. So this is one part, so this is one quite obvious but important intervention of the book in the literature of which it's a part, the intervention that's making into critical theory. Now, building on this first point, it's interesting to note how little of a role colonialism or imperialism even play in the theory of injustice and oppression that Young develops. However, the concept of imperialism does, of course, make an explicit appearance in one of the 5 faces of oppression, and that's in cultural imperialism. Of course, we can identify the usage of the term imperialism here, following Tuck and Yang, as largely a metaphorical usage of the term. And further to my first point, and in keeping with the usage of many critical theorists of the time. But what was Young trying to do with this term cultural imperialism? Well, she was trying to describe an injustice in the cultural or symbolic or ideational conceptual realm that involved one group imposing their symbolic meanings and representations on other groups. But notice here that the symbolic process and form of injustice was treated largely separately and distinctly from the material processes of exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, and violence. It was kind of intertwined with them, but they were ultimately on like different registers. It was like the cultural realm was understood as like a separate realm from the material realm if we kind of followed Nancy Fraser's formulation at the same time. So this was understood as a kind of different kind of claim or a different kind of injustice. Now, against this backdrop, we can see a second very important broad insight and intervention of Robert's book, because Robert is also concerned in part in his book with the conceptual or symbolic realm, but he's deeply concerned to show how material processes and symbolic or conceptual processes are quite directly fused together. Material transformations also bring about conceptual transformations, such that the concepts we use to describe and even critique in the wake of the material transformations are often indebted to, in significant ways, those same material transformations. This is at least part of Robert's absolutely crucial and I would say transformative insight about recursivity in the process of dispossession. Now, this brings me to the third observation about Young's book that helps me, by way of contrast, to highlight some of what Robert is up to in his book. And that is the fact that when she talks about cultural imperialism and the domination of one group's symbolic or conceptual resources and frameworks over another, she isn't thinking primarily or explicitly about languages of critique or resistance. She's thinking about internalized languages and images that are disempowering. In other words, the danger for her of internalizing the oppressor's languages and values and images is that you won't resist or critique your oppression at all. You won't recognize it. Internalization is disempowerment, in other words. But one of the crucial things Rob is doing, I think, is to highlight, analyze, and perhaps implicate our languages of critique and resistance in the process of our colonial oppression and domination. For him, how we conceptualize and critique the injustices and oppressions and harms we face matters, and can itself be a crucial part of colonial or imperial forms and processes of power. Internalized languages, in other words, don't just disempower, but they can selectively empower you towards certain forms of critique and resistance. So where then does this leave colonized groups in terms of the languages and practices of critique and resistance? And again, I'm mindful here that Robert is not talking in general about colonized groups, but I want to talk a little bit more generally here because I notice really similar kinds of debates happening in critical Indigenous studies, critical Muslim studies, critical Sikh studies, which is the field I'm most closely connected to outside of political theory. And so there's something that seems to be common here about struggling against colonial vocabularies and conceptual frameworks in the context of competing normative frameworks and languages. So this is where I want to pose questions to Rob and ask him to elaborate upon what he's argued in the book, especially in chapter 3, which analyzes different forms of Indigenous critique against dispossession. So if I read him right, he says there's 3 forms of critique. One is internal or immanent critique. That is a form of critique that uses the colonizer's concepts and values against them, crucially leveraging the hypocrisy and inconsistency of the colonizer against them. So it's internal to the self-understanding and accepted values of the colonizer. Second is external critique. This, according to Rob, is a form of critique that critiques colonial power and processes from an external standpoint, from a different tradition, a different set of languages, concepts, values, and practices, or he puts it, a different form of life. The third kind of critique he lays out, he talks about it initially as kind of Indigenous syncretism, By the conclusion, he seems to be talking about it as expressivist critique, as I think Isabel mentioned as well, as expressivist resistance and critique. And so it seems to me like this form of critique is one that self-consciously forges or constructs a kind of new tradition, a new set of subjectivities, although not altogether new, but somewhat new, in the wake of the material and conceptual transformations wrought by colonial processes. Because it is centrally and inevitably shaped or conditioned by, but not determined by, at least wholly, the colonial process, it is, in Robert's words, a belated form of critique. It is itself recursively constituted in some crucial sense. But this is what I want to hear from Robert, because I find them so important and his framing here is so helpful. I want to hear more about these three forms of critique, the differences between them, and where he stands in the book in relation to them. On the one hand, the conceptual distinction between them is not always clear to me. For example, in much of the discussion of external critique, it seems to be defined by the fact that it is a form of critique situated in a different form of life, and therefore the terms are not set by the colonial form of life. But why can't an expressive critique also be an external critique, in the sense of self-consciously building, again, perhaps partially, a new counter-hegemonic tradition and a different form of life? So why can't that be an external form of critique? So I guess I'm wondering, does the syncretic or expressivist mode of critique explode the whole inside, outside, internal, external binary? Or does it, as he seems to suggest in other places, still allow for the construction of an external form of life from which to conduct critique? Or why can't external critique be expressive, in the sense that it continues on an established and distinct tradition and form of life, but does so grappling with the effects and transformations wrought by colonialism? So why can't an external critique be expressive in the way that he seems to suggest? This leads me finally to just conclude, to ask where Robert stands in relation to these three forms of critique, or to clarify that a bit. Much of the time he seems to suggest that they are all distinct but legitimate forms of critique by the colonized, and that they have some mutual or reciprocal relationship with one another. But by the end of chapter 3, and then later in the conclusion, he seems to suggest that all normative critique is belated in some way, and that he seems to align himself with the expressivist form specifically, and seems to disavow at times the externalist form of critique. And so I just want to hear more about how he understands these three forms of critique, what ongoing relationship, if any, he envisions between them, or if they are competitors, and whether he is making the case for one over the others. So thank you for the great pleasure of allowing me to discuss this incredible book. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jakeet. Over to you, Cressida.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see so many people online. Welcome. Like David, I'm on Treaty 6 territory here in Edmonton, Alberta. And it's also a great pleasure to have the opportunity to comment on Robert Nichols' wonderful book, which, as I was saying before we opened the meeting, it's difficult to find the time to really read a book seriously and to do that kind of deep dive, and you have to be pushed. So I'm grateful to have been pushed and to have to spend the time with the text. And it's really fascinating to hear Isabel and Jakeet go first as well, just to sort of think about our different, not unrelated, but different receptions that we've given to this text. So I want to say quickly 4 things about what I think is distinctive and valuable about this book, and then they lead into two questions, but really 2 enormous sets of issues that I want to ask about. So the first is, and this is perhaps a little bit clearer even in the very helpful video that Rob made about the book, I think that this argument offers a very powerful response to a certain kind of very frustrating settler response to the ways that Indigenous peoples have been forced to engage arguments about land. And so this sort of inevitable contradiction that on the one hand, well, you say that land is not property, land is not something that can be owned, but on the other hand, you want it back. There is sometimes in the most reductive versions of that contradiction, as it's expressed in more kind of popular politics, almost a kind of gotcha nature to it, right? Like a sort of glee that somehow the settler commentator has caught out Indigenous people in a contradiction that somehow undermines their own politics. And so just speaking at the level of that kind of very crude popular discourse, what I think that Robert's book does very well is to show how this language is a product of a settler history, a history in political thought and intellectual history that has made itself and presented itself to Indigenous peoples in a particular way that creates a sort of trap, right? So it puts the political responsibility and the historical weight where it belongs. And that, I think, is a really important kind of political response to something that we see all the time in this much more attenuated and frankly, much more racist form. So I really appreciate that call out of a certain kind of hypocrisy that's part of the book. The second thing that I think is really, really clever and helpful is this analysis of recursivity, which again is a phenomenon that probably many of us recognize, but it's very difficult to pin down, and especially using this kind of very nuanced theoretical language that Robert uses. And so he says, I'll just read a little bit, this is page 91. Recall, however, that recursion is not simple tautology. Rather than a completely closed circuit in which one part of a procedure refers directly back to its starting point. So it's not just a looping effect, right? Recursive procedures loop back upon themselves in a bootstrapping manner, such that each iteration is not simply a repetition of the last, but builds upon or augments its original postulate. Recursion, therefore, combines self-reference with positive feedback effects. This feature is occluded by the language of structures, which cannot account for dynamism within endurance. So I think that this quote is just incredibly important because it's describing not just a feedback effect, not just a loop, but the way that that feedback effect amplifies itself. And to do this through this very careful genealogy of the concept of dispossession is, I think, a tremendous gift intellectually, but just to show how languages have this sort of self-enclosed nature that forces us into deploying them in ways that then exaggerate them or force us back even more onto deploying them again, right? So that kind of cyclical effect with its amplifying consequence is, I think, really important. And as I'll suggest, it is actually relevant to other kinds of languages as well. And it also explains, as the last sentence of that quote shows, that when those of us who are sort of engaging in critical theory or radical political thought talk about structures, one of the things that it becomes difficult to explain is what Robert calls dynamism within endurance. So how there are processes of change within these structures. And that, I think, is a really important addition to some of the analyses, maybe the analysis, like Jakeet said, Young offered us in the 90s, that find it very difficult to explain the sort of evolutive nature of some of the processes that we want to challenge. So I have to say, I'm having my windows cleaned, and of all the moments in the season, they've picked right now to just clean this window, so, and the one behind me. So if someone sort of appears or I go in a weird way, that's because there's someone standing like about this far away from me cleaning the window. I don't know why. It's been weeks we've been waiting for them to come. Anyway, so that's the second thing. The third thing, and really the point about recursivity is another way of saying this, and Jakeet also described some of this. I really appreciate the method of the book. So I've got another quote. This is the only other thing I'll read. So on page 146, Rob says, much of what passes for contemporary critical theory fails, in my view, to pose, let alone adequately grapple with, the predicaments presented by the problems of recursive meaning. Despite near continuous invocations of historicity or the social embeddedness of thought, much critical theory today advances in a decidedly presentist, ahistorical, analytic mode. Meaning is assigned to terminology rather than reconstructed from the history of its uses. Although frequently posturing as political, this work often turns out to be meretricious. Insofar as it fails to historicize the terms of present conflicts, it further tethers us to them. So I think that might be my favorite paragraph in the book. And it's also, I can hear Rob saying things like that, and it's a little bit cranky and snarky, which I also really appreciate. As somebody who also sometimes writes in a voice that's intended to be a little bit acerbic, I like the moments where he's like, you know, we've all met these people who say that this is what they're doing, but they really don't do it. And we have all met those people. So I like the way that he is able to kind of skewer that style of theory writ large, which in so many ways is not lining up with its own aspirations. And then finally, the thing that I think is really valuable about the book is the way that it connects intellectual traditions from within non-European worlds, non-white worlds, non-European canonical worlds to each other. So often what passes for doing progressive work in political theory and critical theory is to sort of take some kind of canonical European figure as the center of the wheel, and then the sort of spokes radiating out, right? Like you're able to connect something else to that center. And some of that work is valuable, but when it's repeated as a pattern in our disciplines, it also reinforces Eurocentrism and other kinds of ways of foregrounding a narrow canon. And so I especially appreciated the way that Black radical traditions are brought into connection with intellectual Indigenous tradition, with feminist tradition, and those bodies of work have a conversation among themselves. And I think that that's incredibly important intellectually as well as pedagogically. So those are the things that I appreciated, and my questions come out of those things. So the school bus has just arrived. So my son is now getting off the school bus and having an encounter with the guys cleaning the windows. So of all the 10-minute periods in this day that this could happen. Okay, so someone's dealing with that. Okay, good. So the first question or set of questions is, a lot of what's going on in this book is showing how the constitution of subjectivities is mutually informed by the constitution of things, right? So especially ownership and property. And there are many points where that comes up. So the discourse of property creates its own objects, whether that's land or whether that's slaves, right? People who become property. And the way that the Black radical tradition critiques that discourse as it pertains to self-ownership is, I think, really important here. And I was also struck by a moment in your discussion, Rob, of Laura Kellogg, this Indigenous figure, where you attribute to her the view that dispossession is partially constitutive of the modes of subjectivity and forms of group identification, e.g. settler, native, it engenders, but it is not determinative. So all of that, of course, is a huge theme in the book. And there's also a critique going on here that the reclamation of the idea that you can own yourself has so often been a ruse of a kind of white feminism that says, you know, we get to own ourselves. White women should be able to own ourselves, but without really undercutting the discourse of which it's a part. And that's a feminism that I've often struggled with in various ways. So I wonder if you could say more about the recursivity of the subject position of owner, because I think that there is a lot more to say about this. So does the bootstrapping by which everyone comes to seem like, everything comes to seem like something that can be owned, also translate into everyone seeming like an owner? And I've been particularly struck by this in teaching some material in my courses this term on neoliberalism and the way that neoliberal economic language comes to colonize, if I can use that word, areas of discourse that we might previously have thought of as ethical or political. So this is, for many people, really the definitive feature. What makes a particular moment, a neoliberal moment, is the way that it comes in and takes over areas of social life that weren't previously defined through economic language. And I think that the idea that, for example, the issue that my students were grappling with is we read something that was intended as a critique of the idea that individuals are the bearers of human capital, which is, of course, familiar to all of us as a kind of important 20th century idea that came to define neoliberal discourse. And it was very difficult for them to think outside it. They couldn't get outside the paradigm of, well, it's really being the owner of themselves, but in the sense that their human capital was almost like, it's almost like they have to mix their labor with themselves to build their capital, if I can use that weird kind of Lockean analogy. And I think of moments like that, and I think your analysis could actually expand into more political problems. And I wondered what you think of that, and of course how those problems are connected to settler Indigenous politics today. I mean, it's not like just because it's gone into that new problematic that it's somehow separate from your original zone of inquiry. So that's one. And then the second question is, I'm really intrigued by the phrase rituals of anti-will, which you talk about. I think you attribute it originally to Patricia Williams. Yeah, and then the implication, I mean, the idea that I can only exercise my will by consenting to it being extinguished, or I can only consent to something involving myself in a way that will extinguish myself or abnegate myself, right? And so I think that the concepts of will and consent are really important and interesting there, and again have applicability to other kinds of problematics that are also not disconnected from your original one. So there's a lot of, this might be a bit straying a bit too far, but there's a lot of talk in critical work on sexual violence about the limitations of the concept of consent, and thinking about rituals of anti-will really reminded me of that stuff that I've done some work on, and the incredible and incredibly disturbing extent to which giving consent to sex, which is taken in Western law to be a criterion of something not being a sexual assault, is so often, indeed maybe dominantly, used now as a way of excusing sexual violence, right? Like that's kind of, it's a controversial thing to say, but that's in so many ways, the way that sexual violence is allowed is because, well, somebody consented. And it's incredibly troubling. And so I think about that particular ritual of anti-will. And then the other thing I think of, and I was a bit surprised that I don't think this text appeared in the book, was Audra Simpson's article, The Ruse of Consent, and her more recent, her post-Mohawk Interrupters work that she's been doing on this question. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about how the critique of rituals of anti-will dovetails with Simpson's work on the politics of refusal and the way that Indigenous insurgencies that she is talking about are connected to the language of contract and consent, and what she describes conversely as a politics of refusal that I think very explicitly takes up your language in the context of attempting to think through particular acts of Indigenous resistance. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Cressida and Jakeet and Isabel. Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, yes, thank you so much for these incredibly generative comments and critical engagements. I mean, there's so much to work with here, so I'll try to be, I can't be both comprehensive and brief, so I'll try to strike some balance there so that we can have more of a back and forth and get more voices in. Let me try to touch on a few of the things that people have mentioned, particularly regarding I think, the self-constituting dimension of these processes that I tried to describe. So when one one of the aspirations of the book was intentionally to try to write something that was narrow in scope, but broad in implications. So I really tried hard to write something that was quite narrow in the sense of taking up just one dimension of a really complex set of historical processes, and not trying, even aspiring to give a comprehensive or exhaustive survey of all the different ways in which different kinds of analytics or lenses that one might bring to bear upon this. And so that meant sort of carving space away by saying all the things I wasn't doing in the book, and much to my editor's like chagrin, because my editor kept saying, you spend a lot of time about what you're not saying, and you should just focus on what you're saying. But two of the things that I'm trying like not to do in the book is so the book is not sociological or historical, in the sense that it's not meant to be a general description of a set of historical processes. It's rather a study of a kind of argument. It's a study of a form of critique that emerged out of those, which then looks back upon a set of historical and sociological processes with a particular lens or with a particular frame of reference in mind. And the point being that the argument about the processes draws upon language which is itself part of the processes under description. So it's recursive in that sense. So the object of study in the book is not an exhaustive description of all of the different dimensions of colonization, nor is the book attempting to present, in a sense, my theory of dispossession in a kind of analytic or ideal theory sense. This isn't a theory of dispossession. It's a study of how the arguments about dispossession emerged over time, and what those entanglements, what entanglements result as a part of that process. And so in a sense, that's the object of study, is the emergence of a kind of form of critique, which I'm trying to reconstruct and reformulate in a certain way, but also turn into itself an object of analysis. And it was hard to do that without, what I want to say in the book is that it's not meant to be, it's meant to complement other kinds of arguments that people might make in relation to these processes. It's not meant to exclude or say that this is the only sort of argument that anyone could plausibly make, but it is an argument that people have made. And I think that it's an important argument. And so it's not exhaustive, but it is distinctive. And it is, I think, necessary. And the reason why it's necessary is that there are other kinds of very important arguments which have been mostly developed by Indigenous peoples themselves, which take on the form of more what I call in the book form of life critique. So this is what Jakeet was talking about in terms of a kind of external critique, or what Isabel was talking about when you were referring to the more robust and elaborated arguments about the earth as an object of desecration. And those arguments take the form of saying that there's an alternative form of life that is more sustainable, that is more valuable, that is more morally defensible. And it's from the standpoint of those particular forms of life, often very specific, so a Nuchano argument or a Haudenosaunee kind of argument or an Inuit argument, that are developed from a very particular cultural location and often spiritual tradition that attempt to elaborate the positive normative connections that people have to the earth, which are not reducible to those proprietary kinds of modes which they've been sort of forced into. And my hope is that the book can complement those kinds of arguments, not to be seen as a competitor to them. But I do think it is necessary to complement them. So it's not just a kind of addition on the side or something. And the reason why it's necessary is that the thing that is presenting those kinds of arguments with the problem is that the process under description, which they are opposing, is a process that forces people into a certain logic of exclusion that is very hard, if impossible, to get out of entirely. Because if you want to defend a position that a proper relationship to the earth is not one characterized by a relationship of exclusion, where you demarcate a spatial zone and you exclude others from that. The problem, of course, is that you have to, at minimum, exclude the excluders, right? You have to, at minimum, find ways to stop those who would turn the earth into property from transforming your non-exclusionary form of life. And so you have to be able to develop a critique that can use a way to find a language to exclude the excluders. And that's the dilemma of dispossession, as I'm trying to describe it in the book. One of the kind of, if I can use a little bit of a sort of parable, so to speak, that I thought of a lot while I was working on the book, but I wasn't sort of courageous and poetic enough to actually put in the book, was that I began to think about it something like this, that if there's a person who, let's say there's a person who builds a home, that person puts 4 walls around themselves. So they create an internal space, the size of a house. But what they've also done at the same time is they've created a second space, the size of the rest of the earth. So they've actually done 2 enclosures. They've enclosed themselves, and then negatively, they've enclosed everything else. And if more people come along who do that, they slowly start to enclose the earth that way until there's only one person left who's not enclosed the earth. And that person finds themselves in a space the size of a house. So that person has been de facto enclosed into an exclusionary space. And for them to make an argument as to what's wrong with that, they have to have, I think, a double-facing argument. They have to have an argument that explains their alternative way of articulating this, but they also will be forced into the dilemma of trying to push back the excluders. So in other words, put more concretely in the terms of the book, when Europeans began to divide the earth through zones, geospatial zones of exclusion, they already started to enclose indigenous worlds before they even arrived in North America. Because as soon as they did that to Europe, they, by contrast, began to enclose the rest of the earth. And that produces a kind of dilemma on the side of those who are facing that kind of logic. And it's not just an argument, of course, it's a set of institutions that are grounded in property. And property is a very peculiar kind of set of institutions because it has this kind of logic of exclusion. The nature of a property claim is that it's exclusive in this way, and it causes those who seek to resist it at least leverage some argument to exclude the excluders. And that is the kind of dilemma that I'm trying to think through. And I think that the term dispossession partially emerges, and the reason why it's an ambivalent term constantly over time is because it has to kind of, it sits uneasily on the cusp of that, of having to work both with it and against it. So that's kind of what I was trying to describe. And there's 2 faces to that dilemma of the excluding the excluders, because a property claim is a kind of claim that does at least 2 things. It relates a person to a thing, that is this kind of a mediated relationship to an object or something that becomes the object of property. But it also turns one into a claimant of sorts. And so it is when I'm talking about the subjectivizing effects of it, I'm not talking about what people are like in their kind of actual lives, all the way down, socialized completely. People have all kinds of different roles, and they're never completely scripted by this, including most indigenous communities and most indigenous peoples. They have a variety of different sort of subject positions and ways of self-identifying. what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the subjectivizing effect and the belatedness of it is that the standpoint of the claimant in the form of the argument has to take this form, because the claimant position, when one makes a property claim, it establishes the injustice in question as an injustice against a person in virtue of their status as an owner. And so it reflects back on the person, thereby situating them from the standpoint of their argument as an owner, and that this is an offense to their status as an original owner. And that's the kind of subject constituting dimension of it, not meaning that any particular individual person is sort of scripted all the way down in their whole life, that they come to completely attach and self-identify. I mean, some people maybe do, some people don't. But the point is that the structure of the argument positions them as that kind of claimant. And so I want to show how you can work with and against the way in which you are projected as an original owner only sort of after the fact. I think that I'll speak to just two more things that were raised by Cressida with regard to that. One of them is about, so alternative, other kinds of movements and struggles that have a similar sort of dilemma that they face. So I think that today there are lots of examples of different sorts of struggles that take on this, they have the face of this kind of problem. And they do because I think that increasingly lots of people find that they are losing things that they didn't even think of themselves as having in the first place, right? That there are things like the air, or like our personal identity, or like ideas or language that we don't think of as our property until we've lost them, and thus are forced to consider them as our property and forced to speak of ourselves as if we were the original owners of them, but only after the fact. So that's why it's sort of belated. And the reason why we don't think of them as property in the first instance isn't because we sort of overlook them, that is, that we take them for granted, that they're not important to us, but rather the opposite, that they're so important that a person wouldn't have conceptualized them or as something that could be in principle detached from the community, because it's so embedded in a form of life. I mean, how could one lose your personal identity or a concept or a language or whatnot? Well, it's only after it's become propertyized in such a way as to systematically divest you that you see yourself as, in retrospect, the original owner. So I think there is that kind of dispossessive logic taking place in a number of different kinds of struggles around, say, personal identity or intellectual property and whatnot. And I hope that the work of the book provides some arguments for at least naming that particular kind of dilemma or logic. But I do also want to insist a little bit on a bit of a cautionary note with regard to that. And the cautionary note is that I don't want to think of these other kinds of struggles as merely analogous to the kind of indigenous struggles that I'm taking as my sort of primary empirical referent here. They're not analogous to one another because the first, that is the indigenous struggles over and with regard to the earth, establish the horizon on which the others are situated. So they're already causally related, because the indigenous struggles that constituted the rise of the English-speaking world over the course of the 19th and early 20th century really produced the world within which those other struggles are now situated. So they're nested in a way. And that's why I think it's a bit of a mistake to too quickly kind of analogize across these different sorts of movements. One has to think of them as causally connected through waves. The last thing with regard to the question about will and consent, it's not a coincidence that it made you think of those feminist debates, because it really was, it took a very long time for it to kind of percolate through my brain to figure out why that was such an important dimension, I thought, of all of these issues. But it really was through conversations with you, with people like Chloe Taylor, with other feminist scholars who are thinking through those questions, that I really started to think through, and I've drawn a lot from that feminist scholarship around the issue of consent that really helped to kind of crystallize much later when it came time to thinking about this, what was so troubling about the way that free, prior, and informed consent is articulated in the context of Indigenous politics, where consent has become such a big thing. And there's at least two dimensions of the kind of feminist debates that I thought were just really important, which I've drawn upon here. One is that the feminist debates rightly pointed out that consent isn't just a kind of like a light switch one turns on or off. It doesn't just have a on or off position, but rather that the power context within which consent is articulated, shape and inform its structure so much. So there are all kinds of problematic gray zones, because even if a person sort of overtly consents to something, we have a responsibility to ask about what power asymmetries structured that. Whether people in totally asymmetrical power relations can really completely consent, even if they sort of verbally give a consent. And that's a long-standing kind of feminist concern about the power context that informs and structures consent. But the other aspect of it is the point that consent, if it is to be authentic, has to be bimodal. It has to be possible for someone to say no, and for that to be genuine and definitively heard. If a person can only really ever say yes, then we have a reason to question the yes, so to speak, whether it's a really authentic form of consent. And basically, I think that in the context of Indigenous politics, what has happened is that Indigenous consent has been sort of funneled such that it can only ever be fully legible and accepted in one form. It's not bimodal, right? It only has one form of expression. So Indigenous, you can see this right very vividly right now in the contemporary treaty process, that when Indigenous peoples enter into the treaty process, they are said to be they're asked for their free, prior, and informed consent with regard to the exploitation of their lands, but they can't really completely say no. Every no can only be heard as a not yet yes. That is, it will only delay the next round. And so what happens is they are slowly being funneled into it, but every yes is definitive, and then that extinguishes the title. So it ratchets only in one direction, right? It can only ever go, it's unidirectional. And I think that that's something that feminist scholars have thought about for so long in completely different contexts, but the sort of structure of the way in which consent is being kind of funneled into a monodirectional form is just really important for thinking about how a logic of governance uses consent against people in these kind of situations. So let me stop there and get more responses and questions and comments, and then I can hopefully circle back to some of the things I didn't touch on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robert. So feel free, those who are on the call, to open the participant pane and raise hand within that. Or if you want to turn your camera on and just wave, I'll see you that way as well. And this would be a moment if your camera has just sort of accidentally been off to let us see you, though I realize that not everyone will turn their camera on. So please raise a hand on screen or using the raise hand function, and feel free to enter the discussion. And perhaps while we're waiting for that, if any of the panelists, including Robert, want to come in a little bit more. I see something from Drishadwati. Do you want to, I will have to unmute you, and feel free to come in.
Hi, Robert. Hi, everybody else. I have a question. I haven't read the book and I didn't get a chance to listen to the talk that was on YouTube, so please pardon me. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the term expressive insurgency and how is it to be distinguished from other forms of insurgency that may not be expressive, or even if one is like expression, not insurgent, like could you just talk about the tensions? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure. The idea is good to see you, by the way, Jersha. The idea is, pretty basic. It's something that has been articulated in lots of other ways by other kinds of thinkers and other movements. And the basic point is that the insurgent dimension is simple, that it's the highly asymmetrical relations where extremely subordinated, dominated parties are struggling in in conditions of extreme domination and asymmetrical relations. So that's insurgent in that sense. And expressive in the sense that there's kind of two dimensions of the struggle going on, I think, that so it's something I discussed at the end of the book, that many Indigenous struggles are organized around very particular objects of concern. So it's something very specific, right? Getting this piece of land, this mountain, this river back. And so there are particular objects of control and struggle. And part of what I'm thinking through in the latter part of the book is about how those struggles are trying, in a sense, to reverse engineer what I'm calling the dispossessive process. So if dispossession entails losing something that you never claimed to have in the first place, then counter dispossession is an attempt to take back something which is not really yours. And the way to do that is you take it back, but then you also try to take it out of proprietary form of control. So out of forms of exclusive control and domination. And so, but the expressive dimension of what I'm calling expressive insurgency is just the idea that while they are struggling over a particular object of concern, this plot of land or this mountain, they're also transforming the language or the vocabulary within which the struggle is taking place, such that in effect, the success criteria, that is how we know whether we succeeded, is itself being changed in the course of the struggle. Well, as you succeed in getting the thing back is the immediate aim, but really what you've done in the process of doing so is transform the language or the terms within which the struggle is situated. So it has an expressive dimension in the sense that it articulates an alternative in the process of struggling over a particular, within the alternatives. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at in that last part.
Other hand raises? And feel free as a panel, because this was meant to be folded in as well, to go back and forth to speak to one another. There are no hands up at the moment, so seize the moment.
So maybe I'll just continue to elaborate a little on this was one of the questions that Isabel asked, was about the limitations of the legal personhood arguments, which has to do with this expressive insurgency. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I am ambivalent about those particular movements. But I think also all of the Indigenous communities that are mobilizing them are also likewise ambivalent about it. And it's because of this complex relationship between the concepts and language, the institutions, in this case, a legal kind of a legal argument or a legal form, and then the much broader sort of socio-historical process that the Indigenous peoples, much richer, much wider, and how there's a kind of necessary narrowing and perhaps distorting of their much broader, expansive understanding when it gets articulated in this particular language and in this particular legal forum. But I still think there's something interesting and hopeful about it as an example of how they are trying to leverage internally legal and conceptual frameworks which will hopefully transcend the legal personhood argument. So the point is that it's not really to gain legal personhood, but it's to gain legal personhood in such a way as to transcend that form itself. And so it bootstraps up out of itself. And that's kind of what I think is, we just need much more sort of study and examples of those kinds of movements, because they're so important. I'm not sure if that kind of gets at your question, Isabel, but that's my first take on it.
Did you want to come in at all, Isabel?
No, I think it actually, I think you respond to my question.
Timothy, would you like to come in?
Yes, can you hear me now? Thanks, Robert and others. That was very interesting. I've enjoyed following your work, and I appreciated, Robert, your the metaphor that you were not willing to give openly before about closing the space. So, I mean, just as a preface, I'm working on core curriculum stuff right now, and I very much appreciate this idea that you consent only by alienating in terms of faculty responsibility for the curriculum. So I guess I have two questions that relate to that metaphor. One is, the first thing is just, so you have the old idea, I'm thinking about the idea of the common ownership of the earth, right? And the similarities and differences with that, with what you talked about. Now, obviously, the obvious differences, you're not talking about common ownership. You're not talking about ownership, right? But there is something here that's shared and then sort of exclusionary. And so there are, traditions that could be boring, that deal with, there's the left libertarians who talk about when we give up this common ownership, we're required to compensate. There are, Kant who problematizes that. So I'm wondering about the similarities and differences between that tradition, those traditions, and I'm also wondering about this, which is, let's say that we're talking about, rather than mastery of the land, which is of course a picture we often have, and instead we're talking about something like responsibility to the land or stewardship, right? So there you might imagine, rather than having competing claims to master the property, you would have competing claims to be stewards over the property. Right. So I'm just wondering how this has been handled, or, in empirical facts, or just how you might theoretically approach this. I don't know if this has been, approached with various indigenous peoples in terms of, we're responsible for this land, or we're responsible for that. Or are there sort of disputes about not who will master, but who will take care of things?
Sure, yes. And I don't think there's any. One of the things I wanted to kind of highlight is that the sorts of problems that we are collectively trying to think through have a conceptual or a theoretical dimension, but they are real world practical problems. And so what that means is that they won't be solved by simply finding the right word. That is, just by finding some conceptual framework that will simply opt us out of the problem. So, well, we just stop talking about possession, we'll start talking about use, or we'll start talking about common ownership, or we'll start talking about rights, and we'll start talking about duties, obligations, responsibilities. I think that it's not inconsequential to change the register of the debate by turning it, for instance, into a debate about the nature of care and caring for the earth, and caring or holding responsibility. And in particular, one dimension that is really highlighted by lots of Indigenous communities when they talk about that is that we have responsibilities to future generations, and there are parallel arguments in kind of Anglo-analytic philosophy about responsibility for the future. So it changes the register of it, but it's not going to sort of completely, it's not a magic trick. It won't sort of completely solve the problem, because what I'm trying to look at isn't just like the discourse of dispossession, but its interactive relationship with a set of power struggles, because every conceptual vocabulary is going to be nested within a set of very asymmetrical kinds of power struggles that inflect and inform what those concepts and categories really mean on the ground, how they get operationalized. And in that regard, it's important to change the vocabulary and change the concepts up, but that But just as important, what happens alongside that is a transforming of the actual power relations such that they can be actualized in a new way. Otherwise, we'll just change into, this is some of Isabel has done work on environmental struggles where the environmentalist movements, they now speak in the language of protecting the earth and whatnot, but the way in which that's actualized on the ground is really looks a lot like another form of simply kind of Western imperialism and a kind of radical displacing of people who've been stewards and tenders of that land for countless generations. So yes, we, I think, need to change conceptual vocabulary, but that happens in tandem with broad social movements. And if there's kind of one uptake from the end of the book that I'd like people to take away is that social movements actually, they actualize concepts and categories, and that's another dimension of this expressive insurgency idea, is that they in a sense make the world become what it is we have in our idealizations. And so you can change the conceptual vocabulary, but you really have to also transform the real kind of social relationships that make those things what they are in practice. And so that's my kind of general take on that.
Thank you, Timothy. Is there anyone else who wants to come in? Otherwise, I will turn it over to the panel for a last kick at the can. Is there anyone who's been wanting to enter the conversation?
I guess I just wanted to mention something that you, Robert, just said about the importance of, how that concepts are not enough, that it's about changing the power structures that exist and in where those concepts exist. And I was thinking that something that your book invites us to think about is that it's not just the fact that these entities of the non-human world are now protected within these are given legal personality, but what does that invite us to think and imagine from ourselves, right? Like this idea that what does it requires from humans to have a different kind of relationship with these entities and with Earth itself, right? Like that, and that requires as well to change these power relations in terms of how human beings relate to each other and to the non-human world.
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Thanks.
And I'll just maybe jump in to also kind of just, because in your response about expressive insurgency, just kind of raised the question for me that I wanted to hear from you about is, again, that this distinction that you have between the expressive and the external. And I want to hear, like, do you see, is that the distinction you're making, or what kind of distinction are you making? At times it seems like the external forms of critique are external because they're based in another form of life. But at other times, in more critical moments, you seem to be saying that an external form of critique is one that's kind of backward looking, committed to like an unchanging tradition. And that kind of came out a little bit in your answer about expressive, because you defined it in terms of it's one where the standards are kind of changing in response to the transformations that are going on. But I'm still not clear then if in your view, an external form of critique situated in another form of life, which are themselves always changing in response to different phenomena in the world, and especially like deep political transformations, could external forms of critique within a form of life not be an expressive form? So why the distinction, or what do you mean by the distinction?
Well, I think, so the example I try to work through in the book would be 3 different kinds of ways of articulating arguments in response to the transformation of the earth into a kind of exclusive grid of proprietary relations. Why is that wrong? Well, one thing we have to ask when we begin to answer the question, why is that wrong, is or what's implicated already in the question, why is that wrong, is why, for whom is it wrong? And there are arguments that Indigenous people have made who have said it's wrong on European, Euro-American people's own terms. Is you yourself are committed to, for instance, the rule of law, and yet you extra legal forms of seizure are deeply integrated in your whole mode of operating, the whole way in which you have like expanded and consolidated your power here. So you violate your own norms and principles. So that's a kind of clear, imminent critique, right? And a form of life critique, as I understand it, is when, so that let's say a particular communities, Haudenosaunee or Cherokee, Dakota, say, we as Dakota, it is a particular offense to our specific understandings of the relationship, the proper relationship to the earth, because of our understanding of the creator, our understanding of the earth, its normative value, and so on. And that's rooted in a form of life which we've lived for however long. And so it has a very particular Dakota or Haudenosaunee or Cree form of life that it's referencing, which is both referencing the norms, where do the norms come from, but also from with the standpoint of the claimant, who is the person making the argument, and they bind their argument to their self-identity claim. Now, I think people can make both of those sorts of arguments, and they're plausible or less plausible in different kinds of empirical conditions. But what I was trying to show in the book was that there's a sort of third mode which emerges somehow in between those two. And it starts by the Dakota or Cree claimant who's making the strong kind of normative argument on the basis of their people's particular relationship, noticing that other people are making similar arguments from their people's particular standpoint. So I'm a Dakota person and I'm making an argument from a particular Dakota tradition, but there's also Cree people who are saying this, and there are Inuit people and there are Maori who are making arguments which are functionally analogous, drawing from their particular traditions, and they're mobilizing those. So what happened, I think, over historical time was, in addition to complementing as a very specific Dakota, Ojibwe, or Cree kind of argument, there emerged something that could be recognizably seen as an Indigenous argument, a sort of shared kind of argument across a range of different kinds of communities who saw themselves as having something in common, two things in common. One, that they were subject to a similar kind of process and thus were positioned structurally within this, positioned similarly as claimants over a thing that they were losing, i.e. land. They could also draw upon these other kinds of traditions, but they'd have to translate them into a broader terminology such that they could be understood as not specific to the Haudenosaunee or Cree, but to be a shared Indigenous form of critique. And so, but the thing is that in the process of articulating that, they became new kind of people. They became Indigenous in the process of struggling and articulating that, because they weren't Indigenous before it happened. They were Dakota and Cree and Inuktitut or Inuit or Cherokee. They became Indigenous and could self-identify. That could be a meaningful appendage to a form of argument, an Indigenous critique, only over the course of articulating it. It's not something that they could have said before it happened. And so structurally, that critique is belated in the sense that it then projects backward and says, yes, we were Indigenous and Indigenous peoples were making this struggle, but they became Indigenous claimants through the process of struggling, which is neither an immanent critique in the first sense, nor a fully form of life externalist critique. It is a form of critique that emerges in the process of the struggle itself. And the claimant of the critique, the claimant in the argument, is partially the product of the process of making the argument.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks to all of our panelists. I see that we're at time. And so this has been wonderful. I know that we could go on.